Hello, and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
I'm Chris.
And we've had a bit of a bugger of a start tonight. I do apologise, everybody that tuned in for the mix earlier on and then was disappointed by silence and random squashed noises and all sorts. My sound card decided to die. It's fine, I've just plugged it into a different port, but I have mentioned my computer is on the way out, and tonight definitely highlighted that it's going to be on the way out quicker than I thought. But my sound card died, so none of the sound was coming through. Then my camera wouldn't work, and then something went wrong with Discord, and none of us could connect. And then Dave's video drivers died.
It's one of them days.
I think it is actually every time I come on to the live stream, something tech-wise fucks up.
Every live stream, Chris.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not just you. There's always something. So when I start up the stream, especially if I'm having a mix first, there's lots of different things that I need to do. So some of them is like setting up my turntables with a virtual audio cable so that they come through and play out and all of that. And sometimes when we start the stream, I haven't unmuted the microphones and stuff like that. So we're having a chat and for ages and only one microphone or no microphones are coming through. It is literally every single time. I can't wait to have a chance to rebuild my machine and set up a nice little process, maybe build myself a little macro that does my startup checks for me. Today, I'd actually done every single one of my startup checks correctly. I just hadn't expected my sound card to have died, which is what caused the first problem. Then when I was replugging it in, my monitor jumped out. And then when I plugged all that in and I came back up and everything, it was just like, no. So, yeah. Yes, nice to see you, Josh, Leon, and Philip. Great to have you here in the chat. Thank you. So we're trying a little new layout today. If any of you have wondered why it looks a little bit different, I know when we had OP on, we had the three of us at the top with the big chat window underneath. Tonight we've gone for a slightly different design. We're still experimenting, we're still learning, we're still new to this live streaming crap. I think we're all a bit more comfortable on a podcast where we can't see our own faces.
Yep.
But yeah, as you say, Dave, one of those days. It very much has been one of those days. And unfortunately, there's no real way to segue that into tonight's topic. Tonight's topic is the problem of dirty hands. Now, that's not dirty hands, that's dirty hands. Yeah, and we're not talking actually about washing your hands because, through this pandemic, everybody should have learnt to do that. It's amazing that people needed to be told to do that, but, hopefully everyone now does wash their hands, especially when they touch something that isn't theirs. But I digress. So, Dave, do you want to take us away and introduce us to the problem of dirty hands?
Yeah, no problem. The problem with dirty hands is both kind of political philosophy and moral philosophy. And it sort of asks the question, can we do the right thing by doing the wrong thing? Generally, it's when we're trapped in a position where we only have immoral choices that we can go through. Generally, it's when somebody else has put us in that position and given us only the options of doing something immoral. But you could sort of expand that for purposes of discussion and just include when you're in a position where you can only choose from immoral things. Is there a right thing that can be done?
So the way it would normally be described by people in general conversation would be the lesser of two evils kind of choice.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the lesser of two evils is a very, very easy way to put this sort of thing. Chris and I actually used to do a lot of push the red button just to see how
So
far we
much
could
fun.
push people's sensibilities, because we would put
So far.
so far
So far.
we'd put really, really, really horrible choices. You know, you've got this horrible thing that you have to do, or this even worse thing that's going to do it. At what level would you agree to do this really horrible thing? Now, the problem of dirty hands is one of those ones that it sort of depends on the moral theory that you're actually examining it with, doesn't it? Because if it's a purely consequentialist moral theory, then really only the outcome is what matters to said, take on morality. The judgment, that's the word I was looking for. So if you get a good result at the end under a consequentialist moral theory, it would be moral. It just that's all that you need to know. But I mean, Dave, have you got a good example of something that we could say actually doing that immoral thing makes us go, "Oh"?
Well, there's a few. One of the classic examples is from Michael Walzer, and it's the bombing of civilians. So think of World War II, and you had the Nazis invading Britain, giving it a final push. They're going to topple Britain, and by toppling Britain, they basically push their way through into the rest of Europe, and that's it. Europe falls to fascism. He calls that supreme emergency because it's, the fall of the free West sort of thing, or the fall of a free Europe. So the choice then is you can bomb civilians and wear out the country, make the country hate the leaders for being at war. Most of us would consider bombing innocent civilians to be an immoral action. But if it's the stake of the country, if the country's at stake and you're going to fall to fascism, does it become okay to bomb civilians?
I mean,
Yeah, it's like you say. Does it become okay? I wouldn't say that it is ever okay to do that, but it's definitely a better option. I'd much rather that, even if I was one of those civilians myself that happened to be bombed, I'd say that it was still better that, I was bombed just to save the rest of the country. And as you mentioned, it wasn't just the country in your example, Dave. You're talking about the entirety of Europe. So
yeah. And by letting Germany win, it would have meant an increase in genocide and, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So bombing civilians becomes a necessary action.
Kill a few people now to stop even more people dying later.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Another popular option is, of course, the ticking bomb scenario, which is a terrorist has been captured, and you know that they have planted a bomb somewhere. And your choice is to either let the bomb go off or torture the terrorist in the hopes of getting the information. Now, most people would agree that torture is never good and always the wrong thing to do. But if you don't torture them, you risk killing everybody in the city.
Yeah. And I suppose the other issue with torture is it doesn't always work. In fact, I think it rarely works. But if we were to assume for the example here that it will work, you've got...
Or even just assume that it's the only possibility to get the answer. Even if it doesn't work.
Yeah. In the time that you've got, I mean, maybe there would be, if you had more time, you could undertake another method, maybe truth serum, which I know isn't fully accurate either, but it does loosen people up. Some form of cocktail like that might be a better option, but you don't actually have that option because you're on limited time. If you don't get this right now, then you risk a city being wiped out. And I can think of arguments in some respects, as much as we say we avoid victim blaming where possible, they're going to kill 1 million people. I've just invented this city with 1 million people. That's it. That's how many there are in this city. They're
Yeah,
going to kill a
that'll
million
do.
people, and it's one person that you're not even going to kill. You might do eventually, but you're going to torture to get this information out. And it might be grueling, it might be horrible, what you have to do to this person, but the torture in this instance is going to work. I think it's definitely a lesser of two evils. It's one of those things that we don't think is right. Again, if you look at it from a purely consequentialist moral theory, you'd say it was actually a moral action. But again, I don't think torturing anyone sits really well, at least with most of us. So I think that's, like I was highlighting in the article, the problem with consequentialism. There is just something missing from a purely consequentialist moral theory. Are there any other moral theories, though, that would outright tell you you're not even allowed to torture the skeptic? I think Kantianism would be one of them, wouldn't it?
Yeah, most deontological theories would tell you that it's wrong because you're breaking a duty to cause it. If you think of something like human rights, it's our duty to not torture people. It's our duty to treat our prisoners well. Therefore, we would break our duty by torturing this prisoner.
Yeah.
But then we also have a duty to protect our citizens.
And it becomes in conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple more examples.
Before you
we
get
can
onto
break
those,
them down afterwards.
I'd just like to say hello to LB and Manny. Nice to have you on the stream as well.
Hey guys.
If either of you did try to tune in earlier, I'm sorry. You can watch the beginning of the stream. I think Discord brokered it. I brokered it. My computer brokered it itself.
It was a problem with dirty hands. Yeah. Do we fix the computer and not stream, or do we just leave everybody waiting? Yeah, so a couple more examples.
Well, isn't there an extension to that as well? That particular example that you go through with the ticking bomb, because you want to go through that one later.
I'll go through. I'll go through that after. We can break down some of the scenarios after. Another scenario is if you think of something like trying to get aid into a third world country. That third world country might be run by warlords.
Yep.
And they might be suffering some kind of famine. So you have to get food to them. But the only way to get food to them is to give 10% of the charity to the warlords to allow them to let you in. So you're left with, do you go with corruption or do you allow people to die?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tough one, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you contribute to funding the warlords who oppress the people so that you can get food to the people?
Yeah.
Or do you let the people starve? So you're left with whichever way you go.
Yeah, I mean, even in the situation where you might try and sneak around them, and let's say you successfully get all of the goods under the radar, those warlords are still going to be there and suddenly going to go, where have you got all this stock from? And then potentially they could even steal more. So if you manage to get 100% to the people, the warlords might actually take more than the 10% if you'd have actually brokered a deal with them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think in that instance, you'd have to. I think if they became unrealistic with their demands, you know, if they wanted a 75% cut, all of a sudden you're not really doing anything to help the people. I mean, you're giving them a little bit of a help, but it's not enough. And if you want to help,
agree there.
Yeah,
yeah, because even if they're only getting 25%, that's still infinite percent more than they'd get if you didn't do anything.
Yeah,
and
my point there was maybe you needed another method. So maybe if you wanted to actually genuinely help these people and they were only going to get 25%, maybe you need to get the UN involved or something like that and
invade them and pretend they've got oil.
Yeah.
Okay. Another example is something known as Sophie's Choice. Have you ever heard of that one? It was made into a film by
It
Meryl
was a
Streep.
film.
Yep.
I've not seen the film. I've had the conversation about Sophie's Choice with you. It's the child one, isn't it?
Yeah. It's woman in Nazi Germany taken to somewhere like Auschwitz, and she's there with her 2 children. And the camp guard comes up and says, "You're only allowed to take 1 child in. You have to make a choice between one of your sons. We're going to kill one, and you can take the other one, or we're going to kill both."
At this point, Chris goes, "Take them both."
Take them all on that person over there.
Sorry, you cut out there, Chris.
I'm saying nothing. Somebody did point out, on a barely related note, somebody pointed out to me the other day that when you're told to pick a favourite child, you're supposed to pick one of your own.
No, that's not fair.
No, not at all.
And of course, another thought experiment to do with dirty hands is, imagine you were working in a jungle somewhere in a rainforest or something like that, and there are local guerrillas, and they're fighting the local government, and they come and kidnap you and take you to their village, and they have 10 people lined up, and they say that one of these people is a kind of informant. You have to pick who's going to be killed, or they're going to kill all 10. So do you make a choice? You have, you either let 10 die, or you choose to kill one.
I'm finding it very hard to think of one of these types of situations where I don't think the consequentialist approach is correct. Because you've got to, haven't you?
Well, 1 second. Before we carry on with that, just like to say hi, Cameron. He made a comment on the previous one. What country did you say had oil? I mean, need some freedom. Yes. So if it's on the moral judgment. So from a fully consequentialist perspective, what you would say is the action is moral, right? Doing the torture, killing the person is moral. Now, that's if you're going down a purely consequentialist route. What I would say is, if you are thinking about it, doing this action, there's something that tells you about it that isn't necessarily a moral action, but it has a moral outcome. Therefore, it's permissible, even though not an actual moral action. Now, from a consequentialist perspective, they would turn around and say, no, it's a moral action because of the consequences it creates. I'd argue that there's something about things like torture, or like with some of our red button things, like raping a baby, or you're going to end up destroying the world. I mean, that's how it went. Your family will die, your city will be blown up, and eventually to the world. At what point of the threat would you do this disgusting act? Now, I don't think any of us would ever agree that raping a baby is a moral action. I mean, that's in a very extreme version of the actual moral theories. Yeah, Chris and I used to put really disgusting questions in debate groups just to see how people would react. Yeah. I'd apologize, but there's part of me that feels that it was permissible because it was amusing.
It was fun.
But yeah, so what you're saying from a consequentialist approach, it will justify the action as a moral action. Whereas I think from my perspective, I would go, it's permissible, but not necessarily moral.
Also, wouldn't the trolley problem count as one of these?
Yeah, but you're not being forced into that position in the trolley problem. So colloquially, it would be. Technically, it's not, because you're in that position rather than somebody else has put you in that position.
So in the
Actually, cool.
in the good place, Chidi was thrust into that situation. So that would be a genuine example
That
of
would
the
be.
trolley problem being a problem of
Yeah.
dirty hands.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, for general conversation, dirty hands could just be, you don't necessarily have to be put in. So in general conversation, you could say the trolley problem is a problem of dirty hands. You have two immoral choices to make. Which one do you go for?
Yeah, it's that's the sort of difference between the problem of dirty hands and a generalistic lesser of two evils type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not necessarily forced into this situation with a lesser of two evils sort of thing. Interestingly, Josh says, does morality necessitate permissibility?
What's meant by that? Generally, a moral action is a permissible action. So if it's immoral, normatively speaking, it's not a permissible action. But it depends on moral theory, how you calculate it. Sometimes it's necessary. You could say it's necessary rather than permissible.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
generally, morality is a good action. It's an action that we should take. It's an action that's a right action. So it's a permissible action. If you think of morality in terms of normativity, an action that's immoral is an impermissible action if you want to behave morally.
I think we actually, the other day, Dave, had a conversation about this because I actually used the term morally permissible, and you corrected me and you said, well, if you're saying something is morally permissible, then you're saying it is a moral action. But there's a distinction between something that is permissible in the sort of things like the problem of dirty hands. It's permissible because it ends with a moral consequence, a lesser of two evils type consequence, but it's not a moral action in and of itself. So
Yeah.
if you were to sort of rate it, you'd have, say, if you had a moral action there, that's doing something good. Someone drops a bag and you'd stop and you help them pick it all up. That's a really minor moral action, but you've helped them out. You've done a little bit of good. Then you've got a permissible action. That's like one of the dirty hands problems. Then you've got like an amoral action, something that is neither good nor bad. It's not really related to morality. So me having a sip of water, that we'd call that an amoral action. Then you could actually have something that was impermissible, which is an action that was usually considered moral but has a negative outcome. It's sort of the opposite of the permissible. And then you have an immoral action. So it's, instead of the usual three, it's adding in a different qualifier for dirty hands. And if you were to flip dirty hands, you'd have clean hands. The problem of clean hands, doing something good for a negative outcome.
It's qualitatively different slightly.
Yeah. Hopefully that didn't confuse you anymore. Hopefully it cleared things up. It's how it's working in my head, and I understand my head is a jumbled mess. So hopefully it helped.
I wonder, part of me is wondering if some of the issue with considering it moral is because we tend, or lots of people tend to measure things in a very binary black and white thing, where we think, so say the torturing the terrorists to save 1 million people. Not saving those 1 million people would be immoral. So if we look at it as a purely black and white, that means that the torture then is moral. But it's not that simple.
Yeah.
But I think it's very easy to get stuck in that kind of very binary thought pattern.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Consequentialism is that sort of black and white binary thinking. Kai Nielsen sort of goes with a weak consequentialist form, where it's, as long as the outcome is good, then it's moral. It's rather than something like utilitarianism or or negative utilitarianism, or whichever one you want to describe, where it's based on pleasure, pain, the reduction of suffering. Nielsen goes for a weak consequentialism, where as long as most people would think this action was a good action, then it's a good consequence, then it's a moral action. So torturing, there is no problem with dirty hands for him when torturing the terrorist, because you've saved 1 million people. That's it. That's nothing more to consider.
Yeah. Whereas I think you need to examine the two actions, don't you? And if you get rid of the saving of the 1 million people, okay, torture. What are the problems with torture? I mean, there's a ton of problems. It's a violent act. You cause suffering, often quite a lot of psychological damage.
To both the tortured and the torturer.
Yeah, actually, a lot of torturers end up with PTSD themselves as well. Yeah, no, very good point. Thank you. And so when you look at that, I mean, there's more, but I'm skimming over it because my brain's gone blank because I've started speaking.
I can relate.
there's a lot of issues with torture, and then compare the two things siloed, and then you can go, okay, well, both of these things are actually quite bad things to happen. It doesn't matter what the person who's being tortured has done in this instance. The actual act of torture, bodily autonomy and consent and all of that was in my head and it just disappeared, but there you go. So all of those things, it's a negative action. It's a negative action in and of itself. But like with the problem of dirty hands, it's showing that in this particular instance, you're saving 1 million people, which is far worse than the act of torturing someone. You have an A-B situation where you can only do one or the other. You have to choose. You have to do it.
This is like you were addressing in your article. I can't remember what the phraseology was. Was it first order consequences and second order consequences or something like that?
Yeah, so that was one of the things I was addressing with consequentialism, is in the sense of how far down do you go with the consequences. So in this instance, we have a first and second order consequence. So you either have the fact that you've tortured someone and saved the life, or you don't torture someone and 1 million people have died. So the problem with a lot of consequentialist moral theories is how far down the line do you actually go? Because if you're just dealing with first order consequences, then, like, for example, the trolley problem is really easy. You save the 5 and kill the 1. But then if you all of a sudden add in a second order of consequences, well, actually, unknown to you at the time, those 5 people were all rapists and murderers, and they've gone on to kill and rape 5 people each. So all of a sudden, your action, if you go to the second order consequence, becomes an immoral action. Just without you even knowing it. And I think they actually highlighted this quite well in The Good Place as well, where they went to things of, just buying a bag of tomatoes from your local shop ended up causing all of this massive negative impact, and you got minus 400 points, whereas before doing the same action would earn you X points, that sort of thing.
But it would also apply to this, would it not? Because the first order would be whether to torture or not. The second order consequence is the people dying.
Yep. But then from there, what do you do? Well, third order consequences, actually half of those 1 million people went on to get into some form of violent act. So, yeah, I mean, that's a figure I pulled out of my arse. I don't know what the actual percentage of people that get involved in violent acts are off the top of my head. But even if it was, say,
less than 50%,
I would very
hopefully
much hope
quite a lot less than 50%.
Yeah, unless you're in Croydon.
I'm in Swindon, so
yeah, pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's the problem. So how far down the consequences do you go? Because you can't go down that sort of infinite line of consequences, but in a certain respect, you're expected to. So, and also with consequentialist moral theories, they don't even take intent into account. You know, I'm intending to do this good thing, but oh, I fucked up and it went wrong. Oh, you've done an immoral action. Well, is that fair?
Well, that's one of the other kind of criticisms you could make about this. Under consequentialism, as long as you save those people, you have committed a moral action. But if the terrorist is strong enough to resist the torture, then the people will still die, and therefore the torture becomes an immoral action because it led to disastrous outcomes. So the question then becomes, can you be moral by accident? Can you be moral through luck? Kant argues that no. Morality can't be determined by luck. It is either moral
choice.
Yeah.
But from a purely consequentialist perspective, you might make the argument that you can do it by luck. Because if the consequences is the only thing that matters, then if I was trying to shoot my wife and accidentally missed her and killed a burglar across the street and saved a family from getting killed or whatever, then all of a sudden, under a purely consequentialist moral theory, I'd have done a moral action. And doesn't that sit wrong with you as well? It does with me.
It does.
There's the other. There's the kind of antithesis of that as well, which was addressed when I went to a talk on psychopathy, where if you put a poison sandwich in the fridge at work and nobody ate it, the consequence is, well, there isn't a consequence, so it wasn't immoral to put the sandwich there. So there's a kind of antithesis of a good thing happening by accident or a bad thing not happening by accident.
Yeah, exactly. And it just seems intuitively incorrect to say that we can be moral or immoral, luckily, or down to the right circumstances happening. Another one for consequentialism, especially in the weak sense, is imagine that you're torturing the terrorist and he has 5 children, say 5 young daughters aged between 4 and 8 or 4 and 9. Now, you line them up and you torture them and you shoot one of them to get the terrorist to talk. If the terrorist talks, you shooting those 5 children is a good thing. But there's something about shooting 5 innocent children to get a terrorist to talk that sort of changes the scenario slightly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that one highlights it even more, because I think a lot of people will go, well, you know, screw the terrorist. You know, he was going to kill 1 million people. He deserves it. But actually, as you mentioned, 5 kids, it could just be 1 child. It doesn't matter. There is at least 1 child in this picture that is completely innocent, has no idea of her father's wrongdoings, and is going to be killed by you, and maybe even tortured first as well, because torturing her is torture for the father, and it's probably a more effective torture for the father, to be fair. And all... So. Sorry?
You'd hope so.
And so all of a sudden you suddenly go, oh, hang on, yeah, no, I even if you were saying that this guy deserves it, suddenly you're thinking his kids don't deserve it. But it's still a lesser of 2 evils. You know, killing these 5 innocent children to save 1 million people,
which is going to include a fuckload of innocent children.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to ask about, just so with like pure consequentialism, do we actually have to consider the consequences of other people's actions, or do we only have to consider the consequences of ours?
That's a good question. I was looking into this in writing my article the other day, and
if we only have to look into the consequences of ours, then torturing the terrorist is always wrong, because 1 million people dying is a consequence of his action, not us.
There's also the other end of that stick as well, is the fact, like I was talking about with the trolley problem, where you've saved the 5 people, but they all go on to rape and murder. That is them taking their own action. It's almost like the dominoes reset. So when someone else makes an active choice, not one that they're forced into, someone else makes an active choice, it's not your fault. So
that is slightly different here, because that would be them acting after you. In this case, with the bomb's already set up. This is an action that has already happened. So that would change the parameters and where you figure that, surely.
But you're thrown into a situation where you can save them or not. So your choice there, it's your action. So your choice is to save them or not. So regardless of what they've done, the fact that they've set it up is clearly an immoral action in the first instance. But your choice in this point is to save them or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you become aware of it, it becomes an action that you can either ignore or take. Think of the people who respond with, I would just do nothing in the case of the trolley problem, because as far as they're concerned, that absolves them of any responsibility. But they have made a choice to not act. So through their inaction, the 5 people will die, whereas they could have taken an action and saved 4 people.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing with the terrorist thing. The people who run the city know about it. Once they know about it, they become morally obliged to act on it, or not act on it and let 1 million people die, meaning that the consequences of their inaction has led to 1 million people dying.
Yep, that makes sense.
So I'm just going to catch up with the chat on this. Sorry, guys, I've ignored the chat for 10 minutes, so I'm just catching up. LB says, it's a very complicated deal. I would think when you have no other options, wouldn't doing the less evil act be more moral? So this is what we were talking about. It becomes permissible, but not necessarily a moral action, unless you're looking through a purely consequentialist lens. So you're doing an immoral act for a moral outcome. That's the whole problem with the dirty hands. Leon says, discussions about ethics are always so stressful to you. I do apologize. You're going to have a very stressful night.
I'm not even remotely sorry. One of us had to not be.
Guest Bard, hello and welcome. Oh, and also Opie, hello to you as well, dude.
Hey,
nice to have you back. I've gone for a new layout for the 3. We should have probably done this one for when we had you on. When you're next back on the stream, we'll go for this one again if you think this is more appropriate. Guest Bard is your son.
Kieran, go to bed.
Shooting 5 kids can't be morally right. No, you're correct. I mean, that's something intuitive within all of us. There is that we would say killing, especially innocent kids as well. We're not just 5 kids, but 5 kids completely innocent and ignorant of the situation. But if the choice is to torture and kill 5 kids versus allowing 1 million people, including a large number of innocent kids, let's say a third of them happen to be innocent kids in this situation, what is the choice that you'd make? Would you kill 5 kids to save 1 million people, including, 250,000? I went for a quarter. There you go. I couldn't work out how many 3s I needed off the top of my head. He's probably just going to type it right away because Kieran's bright. So he'd just be like, oh, you're a fucking idiot. He says, oh, okay. That's probably to you telling him to go to bed.
I didn't mean it because I'm nice sometimes.
OP says 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 3 rights make a left. Josh asks if inaction is still action. I'd say yes, because you're making a conscious choice to say to do nothing, so it's still a form of action. There's even a virtue or a similar to a virtue in is it Taoism or Confucianism called Wu Wei, which is basically the act of inaction, where it's some problems just go away if you let them. I'm bastardizing it, but it's sort of one of the things of if there's a boulder in front of you and you have the time and you imagine yourself as water, over time water will go over and over this boulder and slowly erode it, and eventually you'll be able to get past. So a form of action is actually doing nothing, especially when you're aware of it. So in the situation like the trolley problem or anything like that, as soon as you're aware of it, you become a moral agent and you have the choice to act or enact, and enact is a form of action.
It is choosing the outcome that was going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
I really want to play devil's advocate with this, but I agree with it completely, so it's really difficult.
Kieran says he doesn't think he'd have the guts to kill the 5 kids. No, I think it'd be hard. I think it'd be really hard. It depends on the 5 kids. I mean, you know, some of the toe rags from Croydon would probably be quite easy.
Maybe yeah, Karen, you're
Yours
not
or
considering
mine?
your little brother, are you?
But yeah, I from that perspective, it would be really, really hard to do. But it's just trying to question. Josh brings up something: killing 999 to save 1,000. I mean, what lens are you looking at that through? If you're looking at it through a purely consequentialist lens, then definitely yes.
Maybe not, because the consequences of your action are that 999,000 people have been killed. So really, it would have been better to let the
1,000
1,000
die. Yeah. I suppose it is a balancing act. I mean, if they were going to die anyway, yeah. If you were to say maybe 500 to save 1,000,
different story. Yeah, because it checks and balances.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough.
But that's exactly what we used to do with the red button questions, isn't it? It's like, okay, 500, okay. What about 600? What about 700? And just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and finding where each person draws that line. And
quite often it ended up with us getting blocked.
yeah.
Well, that's basically what moral thought experiments are. They're red button questions.
Yeah. Well, it's
worded slightly more complicated.
Oh yeah, definitely. But it's like the trolley problem. A lot of the problems are actually all trolley problems. Even when you go to like the doctor problem and the terrorist problem and things like that, they're essentially all the same problem with different context.
Yeah.
How much bad is worth the good?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Josh was making the play on 0.9091 bar is equals 1. He might do. But that's not quite the same equation if we're going to be pedantic. Which I will be, because I'm an arse. I actually used that example in the knowledge versus information article. I don't know if you checked that one out. Trying to explain the difference between information and knowledge. And the use of the word know. And yeah, I know this information, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have knowledge. Because knowledge is far more complex than information. I'm digressing off the point though, sorry. So is there a particular problem of dirty hands? Hi, Leon. Is there a particular problem of dirty hands where you think that you shouldn't get your hands dirty?
None that I can think of.
Yeah.
It really, It really depends.
Yeah, I mean,
I was going to say, I think it depends on who you are. If you are somebody who is held up as some kind of paragon of justice and morality, then maybe not. But that's the only thread I can think to pull at.
yeah, I think like when Josh turned around and said, "What about 999 to save 1,000?" That's possibly a good example, but that's not how necessarily any of the problems work. And obviously through different lenses, as we mentioned earlier, if you're looking at it through a deontological theory, generally the answer would probably be no, but there could also be justifications because you've got conflicting obligations. From a consequentialist theory, they're actually quite easy to answer, because lesser of two evils type thing is just easy. There's no problem of dirty hands, is there? Because it's just the consequence. So I suppose it just depends on how you actually take a stab at morality, as to whether you do it. But if we think about it from a virtue ethics point of view as well, because we don't really, when we think about the problem of dirty hands, we don't really address virtue ethics. So with all of these problems, what would the virtue ethicist say about them?
That it would take a sort of value pluralism approach, in that you would do the thing that was the most honorable thing, which would be saving the people. If you think of it, I was going to go in about duties and stuff before this, but if you think of it in terms of, you have a duty to protect the innocent. So torturing the terrorist kids to get to him wouldn't be virtuous, because you would be breaking that duty to protect the innocent, and it would be non-virtuous to punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty.
Even though you'd be saving more innocent people.
Yeah, because you would be doing something that wasn't virtuous. And torturing the terrorist wouldn't strictly be virtuous, and you would have to admit that you acted in a way that wasn't virtuous. But it would be less virtuous to let everybody die simply because the terrorist doesn't deserve to be tortured.
But wouldn't it still be less virtuous to let the 1,000,000 people die than to kill the 5 innocent people?
Yeah, but it's a matter of,
it definitely muddies the water.
Yeah, and with virtue ethics, it's a matter of taking the most virtuous step. So assessing everything and taking everything into account. Torturing the kids, killing the kids is like better than allowing the 1,000,000 to die, but you have a better choice to make in that you could torture the terrorist.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so it's about assessing the value of each action and going with the action with the most value and the least harm.
Can't keep your hands clean, but you can dip them in mud instead of dipping them in shit.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
Just like to say welcome to Bearded Heretic. Nice to have you here. We are talking moral philosophy, specifically the problem of dirty hands. So what we mean by that, you might colloquially have heard of like the lesser of two evils. It's essentially talking about, can you do something wrong for a moral outcome? So do something immoral for something moral. And we were just talking about how with a consequentialist moral theory, a purely consequentialist moral theory, whatever you do doesn't matter because it's the consequences. So there is no dirty hands looking through a purely consequentialist lens. So if you had to torture someone to save 1,000,000 people under consequentialism, it would just be considered a moral action. Now, we were talking about how torture seems like something that is innately wrong, and we moved the example to say torture didn't work on him, but he had 5 daughters, and you could torture and kill his 5 daughters to get the answer, which would then save 1 million people. In a way, it's still a better outcome, but it's a lot worse thing that you have to go through in the meantime. And then we were talking about how maybe a virtue ethicist would respond, and looking at it through a deontological lens as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about something like a deontological lens, where it's duties that you're bound by, you would then have a duty to protect the innocent. So in the case of torturing the small children and allowing the population to die, you have 2 conflicting duties, because you're supposed to protect both parties. So which one would you go for? You'd sort of be frozen in an action, especially if you take into account the duty to treat prisoners fairly. You're left with 3 choices and unable to make a choice and frozen in an action.
He's basically become Chidi.
Yeah, and that's what Chidi was a
He was a
deontologist.
Kantian, wasn't he?
Yeah, which is why he was always in that situation where, what do I do?
Yeah, because he couldn't make a decision because he had so many conflicting obligations and promises and things like that. He's got his obligation where he couldn't lie, but he'd promised not to tell, and by not telling, he's lying. And he's such a great character.
Except almond milk. He was happy to drink almond milk. But he felt guilty.
He did feel guilty about it, and that's why he thought he got sent to the bad place.
But yeah, that's one of the problems with a deontological approach, is that you can have several different conflicting duties, and the idea is that it's just wrong to break a duty. There is no middle ground. It's just wrong to break one of your duties.
And in that situation, you'd end up breaking one no matter what.
Yeah. So you have a problem with dirty hands then.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm going to ask for some clarity from Dave, because Joe's seen me throw this phrase around quite a lot recently, and I still haven't actually looked it up properly, about moral particularism.
That's the idea. It's a sort of value pluralist approach, in that we judge an action based on the particular circumstances. So if you imagine a mother stealing milk for her child, now generally we would say it's wrong to steal. But if we think about the consequences of the actions, in that not allowing her to steal the milk would cause a child to starve or get ill, we have to take that particular thing into account. And it could also be that she's been put in this position because she can't get help from anywhere else. So we have to take that into consideration as well. She was doing what she thought was the right thing. That it's particular circumstances taken into account when judging the moral value of the action.
And I think that's a very relevant thing when we're looking at things like dirty hands. It's like, well, yeah, deontologically, you really shouldn't do that, but look what happens if you don't. But
yeah,
also you can't be purely consequentialist because of all the conversation that's happened before now. But I'm really liking the idea of moral particularism, and I think it kind of also bridges the gap of where I have the issue between objective and subjective morality, because it makes it situational, but it allows for objective rules, but it allows for that kind of yes, but if
it allows
that.
for understanding.
Well, that's the thing, though, with something objective. I mean, this is one of the common misunderstandings I think people have as well, is objectivism does allow for nuance, because it does have a slight it depends on the moral theory that you're applying, but it does allow for nuance. It's not saying that it's an absolute standard. It's not saying like a deontological theory will say, no, this is the rule, no matter what, you must not lie, you must not steal, you must not kill. Forking trolley.
One for Philip, he's just said he likes the Good Place references.
So, I mean, yeah, objective doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't allow for nuance. So it does apply very well to it. So if you actually think, if you go back to sort of the purpose of morality being flourishing and well-being, living a good life, whatever, and you can draw objective statements from that, and you go, this is a generalistic rule, but actually in this situation, this rule actually can't apply to this sort of thing. We have to twist it. And in this particular situation, this is objectively the best path, whereas this situation, this is objectively the best path. I mean, you can think about it in a really simplistic way. Think about, you need to travel to Scotland in the quickest time possible. And at 5 p.m, it says to take the little roads, and at 2 a.m, it says to go on the motorway. You know, because the context has changed slightly, you've still got two objective standards, and they're both, you know, right for that particular situation. I should catch up with the chat as well quickly. I'm being really bad at staying on top of it of you guys tonight. OP asks, is the kid drowning a trolley problem? No, you're probably right. I assume by the kid drowning, you mean someone throwing a kid into a pool and you jumping in to save them, so you could go, look at me, I'm great, I've saved a child. Is there a different kid drowning problem that I'm not aware of, Dave?
There's Peter Singer's, where it's, if you see a child drowning in a pond, and you can save that child without causing any harm to yourself, then you have a moral obligation to save that child, because that's what good people do. And the idea that if you ruin, say, your genes or something, and it costs you a little bit of money to save the child, that's fine. But if it's a situation where you jump in and you might die yourself, and just keep creating this overflow of people jumping in to save the two people, and then somebody needing to jump in to save the three, then you might have an obligation.
But I really like these genes.
It would cause me more displeasure to ruin my genes.
I fucking hate that kid. So, I mean,
well, there is a response similar to that called lifeboat ethics.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Sorry, catching up on the chat still. Philip likes the Good Place references. Yeah, forking great, isn't it? It is one of the better ones. OP says, what about the duty to not snitch? What, because snitches get stitches? Are we looking at it from a duty perspective, or are we looking at it from a consequentialist perspective?
Well, if you were in the mafia, wouldn't you have a duty to not snitch? You
definitely would. Yeah. In the same way that if you're a doctor, you have a duty bound by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. Similar sort of thing.
And then you throw in the problem, is there a greater duty to society than to your own social sphere?
Yeah, but then if you're actually a moral character, would you be in the mafia?
I'm saying nothing.
Because people are liking the Good Place references, I ordered myself a copy of Eleanor Shellstrup's file the other day.
Nice.
Lives in front of my TV.
Brilliant.
Nice. Yeah, I got to admit, I've got the Blu-rays downstairs.
So good.
It's a show worth supporting.
The Bearded Heretic says, can someone define deontology? I hear the word a lot, but I actually don't know its definition. From a really simplistic approach, it's your rules and duties. Do you want to give a more colourful explanation, Dave?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. Deontological ethics are the idea that duties are universalizable. in that if an action is right, it's always right. If an action is wrong, it's always wrong for everybody in all places. It's sort of absolute, but it's the idea that we have duties to each other as moral agents, and there are rules that we should follow.
One of the very easy issues to point out with this is, so from a deontological viewpoint, lying is wrong because it would be bad if people always lied. And then you can raise the whole, well, what about in World War II if you had a family of Jews hiding in your loft and the SS knocked on your door and asked you?
Yeah.
Deontologically, it would be morally wrong to say that they're not there, but obviously that is stupid.
Yeah, and equally,
And
it could tie in a duty to the people who are in the loft to save their life as well, and then you've got a conflicting duty there.
Exactly.
It depends, obviously, on the particular deontological rules. I mean, the main one that we focus on is Kantianism, especially because you can have a lot of fun making silly Kantian plays. Rules is the word. I don't know why.
The
plays.
comic strip that I made.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so basically, the way Kantianism sort of works, and this is a really bastardized version, but if everybody did this action all the time, sort of thing, it would be bad, therefore it's wrong. So if everybody stole from each other, it would be bad, so therefore stealing is always wrong. If everybody lied to each other constantly, it would be bad, therefore lying is always wrong. And that's why
if everybody was having an orgasm constantly, it would be bad. So having orgasms is morally reprehensible.
And that's why it doesn't fully
Don't
work.
blame me,
You can... If everybody was asleep all of the time. So
that was the comic.
It was, yes. So that's basically deontology, and that's why in the show The Good Place, Chidi is a deontologist. He ascribes to Kantian ethics more than everything else, and that's why he has so many problems with his indecisions. He has a duty to Eleanor. He's made a promise to Eleanor, but he also has a duty to not lie, and so on and so forth. And also to all the other people who he feels are having all these bad things happen to them because of the deceit of Eleanor. And that's why his entire life was really fucked up, because he took this stuff really, really seriously. And he was a really good deontologist in the sense that he just never knew what to do.
Which is why an air conditioner fell on him.
Yes.
I think he does develop slightly more towards things like virtue ethics as the seasons go on.
Yeah.
He does have a bit of a arc in that sense. But yeah, that first season and two.
Yeah, you see
it's painful to watch at times.
Yeah.
It is. And it's good the way they do it, because they show him, like you said, he moves more towards virtue ethics, and his disposition changes and his natural reactions begin to change. And as that happens, he still has that stomach pain, but it gets less and less as the series go on. It's really smartly done.
Mm.
Yeah,
I've just finished my my second run through of it, and it's still got me.
Technically on 5.
Yeah, I've watched it a ton of times.
It's such
because the characters are great.
But yeah, you're right. The character's great, and the philosophy in it's pretty good too. And it manages to explain some of these complex concepts, like without you even realizing you've understood something as well. I think that's one of the clever points of it. You've managed to enjoy watching a show, had a laugh, and all of a sudden you've got this itch in the back of your mind, and you've understood something, and you start looking up, maybe like you might do with your moral particularism, Chris, and you start looking up, and you.
Which I learned because of The Good Place. There aren't many times in life when you're going to finish watching a sitcom and think, shit, did that just make me a better person?
Oh yeah, Opie was referring to singers, he says.
See, I know things occasionally.
Yeah, well, to be fair, you and Opie are both smarter than me, so you're probably more on the same wavelength. That's why we used to play red button games, Chris. Bearded Heretic says, can't you take Anakin's point and say that anything can be bad from a certain point of view? You can take that view if you so wish. If you're going to take a purely subjectivist approach, I guess.
I didn't just torture the man, I tortured the women and the children too. I tortured them like they were animals. Yeah.
I think what you need to do from that, though, is actually consider the purpose of morality. And so obviously you understand morality is the principles of behavior as good, bad, right, wrong sort of judgments on said behavior. But what you've got to think about is how how morality came about and what its actual purpose is. And if you look throughout societies forever, there seems to be a goal of not just survival of our species, but that's sort of how it started. If you have a collaborative and cohesive society, you look after each other's well-being, which allows humans to flourish. So if we take that as the end point of what morality is for, flourishing, we can then look back and say, right, does this help humans flourish? Yes, no. And you can do scientific studies into certain things. You look at things like abuse and rape and things like that. There is enough evidence there to objectively say things like rape and abuse are wrong. If you take a purely subjectivist approach, then the rapist deciding that it's a moral action would make it a moral action because that is their decision and they're the actor in that case. Now, I don't think any of us would say the rapist is moral to rape. We'd hold them to a standard above their personal opinion, thus showing that from a certain angle, morality is not wholly subjective, even though there are subjective parts to it.
I mean, generally, when it comes to morality, there's a few different approaches you can take. There's the emotivist sort of approach where there is no truth to moral statements. Moral statements are expressions of emotion. So when we say something like it's immoral to rape, what we're saying is that we find rape to give us an emotionally negative response. But then if there's no truth to moral statements, then it doesn't really say much about whether rape is good or bad. It just says you find it distasteful. There's a subjective approach where you say that the truth maker for a moral statement comes from the person's opinion. And then there's the objective approach, which is the truth maker comes from somewhere outside of personal opinion.
Yeah. So he says, yes, exactly. That's my take. Complex consequentialism. And I take Julian Baggini's point really to heart that you don't need logic to value other people's lives. Psychopaths lack empathy, not rationality. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair enough point. I've not read much of Julian myself. But I think you have, haven't you, Dave?
Yeah, he's really good.
Yeah. You've referenced him in a couple of articles.
Psychopaths don't necessarily lack empathy. Psychopaths have the ability to turn empathy on or off as they see fit.
Yeah. Psychopathy is quite a complex and nuanced thing. We have a very bad understanding of what actually a psychopath is due to movies and pop culture and all sorts like that. We tend to either think of it as the insane murderer, serial killer type thing like that, or like someone that completely lacks empathy. And I think that there's more than just emotional empathy as well, that you can tie into there. It's really interesting. He also says he's a moral objectivist. I mean, I'm with you. I think morality is objective. I think it's more complex than objective versus subjective. I think there are subjective elements, especially if you're speaking descriptively about morality. But I would agree with you that, especially when speaking normatively about morality, it's subjective. I don't think that we've necessarily got there and created a correct objective standard for every action for humanity yet. But let's hope that we get there one day.
Another one which was covered in The Good Place, wasn't it? Where there's the guy sat in the office who has to assign point values to like 13,000 weird sex acts that happen new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The internet changed everything.
Leon says, is that an alternative way of saying I'm a moral realist? And Opie says, moral realism is a meta-ethical position that moral propositions are truth at.
Yeah.
Opie, you should just be on here with us. You can answer the questions as they come in. I mean, you've already done it. All Dave said there was yeah.
Yeah. Makes my job much easier.
You tend to stay away from ethics, do you, Leon? I mean, to be honest, it's one of my favourite topics. Something that I consider a lot, and more so as I get older. It's why I think my political leanings have become moving further and further away from the centre towards the left. Even though I would still describe myself as centre-left, I think I'm going definitely that way. And I think it's also affected, the more I consider it, it affects my interactions online and the way I want to talk to people. In every step of my life, I think about this a hell of a lot more. And that's why one of the reasons why Dave and I have had those discussions of discussions and talking about the Socratic method and having dialectic conversations with whoever you're speaking with, and not seeing people as opponents and not trying to defend a position and attack theirs, but actually searching for truth. Because even then, I think all of these things, the way we interact with people online, has an impact, and there are better ways to broach situations. So yeah, I love ethics, but it can be a complete headfuck at the same time. And there are times where you will sit there crying.
Yep.
What you were just saying then about the approach and looking at things as a discussion instead of a opponent you're having a fight with is something that we discussed quite a lot when we did the discussion on problems with new atheism.
Yeah.
I mean, if
every conversation turns into a fight, and every fight turns into both people declaring that they won.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it does. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I tend not to have many discussions about religion with theists anymore. And when I do, it's more just me asking their positions on things. I don't try and convince them out of their position. I don't really care if they believe in God unless they're doing something immoral in the process. If they're saying that we should kill homosexuals, I will try and take that sort of and try and deconvert them along a long line of things, because actually I don't think that that's a good behavior to demonstrate. But if they're just, you know, your average theist who just happens to believe in whatever deity and religion, most people are generally quite good in and of themselves and don't use their religion as an excuse to do immoral things. So I'd see no point in trying to deconvert them. But what I do try and do is talk to fellow atheists about the way they're conducting themselves online. And it's the antagonistic approach that they take in fighting absolutely everything. And it gets incredibly frustrating to watch this happen again and again. And there's this almost circle jerk of atheists patting each other on the back. Oh, you took that theist down. You were banging there. What, by dropping a meme and running off? Yeah, well done. Going, prove it, prove it, prove it. Really? Really?
Well, I heard it. Sorry, Chris.
I was going to say this is what I really got into for a while, watching the street epistemology video, which is the Socratic method of discussion that you were mentioning before. It's like, okay, but why? Where do you think that comes from? Why is it that you think that's more likely than that? Not just, oh, you're a fucking idiot, prove it. You can't prove it. You're wrong.
Yeah.
Winner, winner.
I think Dave addressed street epistemology in one of our streams, and it's actually only half of the Socratic method, because the Socratic method goes down and tears apart the position through the questions, through a calm and collective thing. But then the idea is you then build back up and try and come to a conclusion, even if the conclusion is, fuck, we don't know enough about this topic, let's go away and have a think about it. Whereas I think street epistemology basically just leaves someone in a position of doubt.
Yeah, I think of it sort of like the Socratic method is deconstruction, reconstruction, and street epistemology is mostly just deconstruction.
Yeah, but you're supposed to be left in a position of doubt because atheism is only lacking a belief in God. Read a book. Jesus.
I'm going, I'll just.
How are you supposed to build up a rock?
You put one on top of the other, don't you? You've seen all of those things.
I was looking at the
Gardens.
bricks outside my house and I was so confused.
I just thought my house is made of atheists.
I actually got into a conversation with someone who was defending that position and going, you should ask him what he really means. No, I really did have a full-blown conversation with him about this, and he even wrote an article off the back of my conversation, which I then did a counter article, and he decided to block me.
That sounds rational.
But yeah, LB asks, can morality be objective but complex, and can it be subjective but simple? That seems to be the case. So morality is very complex. In general, if you were to say morality is wholly subjective, that means the truth maker is based on personal opinion. Therefore, if I decide that it's moral for me to hit Chris in the face, that makes it moral for me to do it because the truth maker is my opinion. It doesn't matter if Chris would prefer me not to do that at all. But that's the problem with a wholly subjective view on morality, because people will go, well, no, that's a wrong action. You shouldn't be doing that. All of a sudden holding people to values above their personal opinion. Now, you can speak descriptively about morality and say, it does seem subjective or relative in particular cultures. This culture says it's moral to throw homosexuals off of buildings. But does that actually make it moral, or do they just believe that it's moral? Is there something about that we can say? Does it represent the purpose of morality, throwing people off of buildings?
Yeah, and you could throw in even more complications to the idea of something like subjectivism with J.L. Mackey's error theory, in that when we make a moral expression, it seems as though we're making a proposition or a statement of truth, when in actual fact, we're just reading the statement incorrectly, and it shouldn't be stealing is wrong. It's I feel stealing is wrong. And there just is no right answer.
Yeah. And by that notion, though, if it all comes down to what people feel is right or wrong, if people feel something that would generally be considered wrong is right, is even then.
There's no such thing as right and wrong in that kind of theory. It's just preferences and non-preferences. And then you throw in an even more complicated one with Singer's preference satisfaction, utilitarianism, where preferences are they actually create truth-apt statements based on what the people prefer, but they're preferences from each person.
I mean, this is where I still get a little bit stuck on subjectivism to a degree, is, as I've explained before, is I think that there are objective rules within subjective systems, because one might think that deontology is right, and one might think that consequentialism is right, and the model of morality that we go by is a choice, but there are objective rules within that, and as I've said before, I don't think it's possible to get a truly normative sense of morality and ethics. There is always going to be that necessity for particularism.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's why I say it's more complex than objective versus subjective. And I think that if you do look into the purpose of morality and try and draw everything back from that, rather than looking at particular moral theories that are supposed to represent this ultimate purpose as a second or third order, or sometimes first order, they're all trying to get to this goal, but they're doing it through, well, I think we should judge it based on pleasure, or happiness, or preferences, or follow this rule. And it's more complex than that. But if you just start with an objective of morality, which does seem to be flourishing, you can make objective statements about what best represents that, and you allow yourself the ability to say, in this particular situation, action A is right, but in this particular situation, action B is right. And in the very rare circumstance C happens, you can do this action, but try and avoid it at all costs everywhere else. So, I mean, that's the way.
In the very rare situation where A and B are equal in terms of flourishing, then it doesn't fucking matter. Do whatever you want.
Exactly. And if you can, do them both.
Yeah.
I mean, it's why thought experiments are kind of important in morality, because the best way to test a moral system is to push it to a sort of extreme scenario and find out where there may be conflicts or inconsistencies or incoherencies, like something like the ticking bomb, showing problems with consequentialism, deontology, that kind of thing.
There is a reason why reductio ad absurdum is the most fun fallacy.
Yeah.
And it's not always a fallacy.
Yeah, it's not always because sometimes reducing the argument to its most absurd can give us good intuitions about the problem.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, also, someone makes a ridiculous statement in the first instance, and then you go, okay, and then you use their ridiculous statement as part of your response to them, and they go, that's a reducto ad absurdum, and you go, that is exactly what you said to me applied through this lens. I'm telling you what your argument actually says. You just haven't thought about your argument. That's not a fallacy. That's actually showing them. It is a ridiculous answer. You have reduced their argument to an absurd level, but it was already absurd in the first place. So therefore, it's not a fallacy, you know?
Well, that's what rocks or atheists are. It's a reductio ad absurdum. Taking the lack of belief thing to its most absurd position. And if you disagree with it, then you disagree with your own definition.
Yeah.
It's like the one that went around for a while. There was the whole theism isn't a belief in God, it's a belief in a higher power. So if God does exist, God's an atheist, because there isn't a higher power than God.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that meme pop up a lot. Is God an atheist?
There was
See, there's a belief in gods.
Yeah.
Dark matter. The dark matter.
Where God went to God, and God to God's God, and God to God's God, and yeah.
It was very funny.
Dave, actually, you did a perfect example with the rocks are atheist thing as well, demonstrating how absurd the statement is. Now, a lot of atheists like to say that we are the smarter, more rational beings than theists. But Dave pointed out that if rocks were atheists, that reduces the average intelligence of atheists to near enough zero that we are definitely the dumber of the two, and that atheism isn't a rational and considered opinion. It's just, being a rock.
It goes even further than rocks at that point, doesn't it? And it does get it infinitely close to zero as an average IQ, because it would include atoms.
Yep. Absolutely
Yeah,
anything that is not a theist.
Everything in the universe, it would be so close to zero, you might as well call it a zero average IQ.
Yeah. And that was met with so much resistance. No, that's not what it means. That's your own argument. It's been put back to you, and you've decided that it's wrong. Do you know why you've decided it's wrong? Because your argument that rocks are atheists is wrong.
Or because they were right to start with, and the average IQ is close to a rock.
Well, I can confirm that my IQ is close to a rock.
Bearded Heretic says, I find philosophy difficult because it's so abstract. My training is in psychology, so I see it through that lens rather than abstract concepts. Psychology is a very interesting one. Dave's got a bachelor's in psychology yourself, haven't you?
Yeah.
And occasionally we dip our toes into a bit of psychology, but it'd be very interesting for you to go into some of our psychological articles and posts and correct us if we've got anything wrong. But yeah, psychology is very, very interesting. One of my friends, Ben, is a psychotherapist, and I often bounce ideas off of him when I'm writing a psychological piece and get him to point me in the right direction. Although my most recent article, he said I can't find anything wrong with that, so that was good. That one was called The Psychology of Rejection.
If you want to look into moral psychology, Nietzsche is a good start, because he basically gives us sort of a motivist type of argument. So does David Hume.
I do think that we should have people listening go in, people who are qualified in areas, go in and look at all of our articles, and then we could have a range of articles on the sites of corrections just entitled Dear Fuck.
That'd be good. Although, most of our stuff tends to be philosophy, and he's got degrees, so does that count as all of them have been corrected by Dave? But yeah, Bearded Heretic just also asked, who's saying rocks are atheist? Aaron Ra. And Randolph the Red-Nosed Lactheist. They're two people off the top of my head who say that sort of thing. Kieran says, I think that ethics has a massive impact on people. I've only had a few conversations with my dad, but it's changed my whole view on the world so much. That's absolutely fantastic, although I wouldn't get your ethics from him. Sorry.
We've had some really good conversations, and I've got him on to listening to old episodes of Fresh Air on his walks to school and back.
Awesome.
And it's good.
I apologise for saying cunt so much.
But is that immoral?
I wouldn't view it as immoral, but if we're in a place where people genuinely feel harm from it, then I should avoid saying it because I don't want to cause them harm.
Yeah, but you do really, because you're a cunt.
This is true. My DJ name is Wizard Sleeper. Opie says, what I think is cute is being told I'm wrong to then tell me to read books that I already have. Yeah, no, I mean, you're definitely more well-read than me, Opie, but I actually had someone tell me that I needed to look up how atheism was used in academia. And then I provided a number of links to how it's tended to be used. And I was told I just didn't understand the articles correctly, and it just means a lack of belief in gods, even though it outright says it's not. And I said, that's a valid use. I mean, I wasn't debating that there were different uses. But I was just saying that the way it's described, especially by a lot of atheist philosophers, is the belief gods do not exist. So under that context, that is how it's done. No, it's not. Okay, here's a bunch of them that describe it that way. No. Okay.
I've had people in Facebook groups tell me that if I'd ever opened up a philosophy book, I would know that I would know that I was wrong.
This is
Did you see
crazy.
that wonderful thread of pictures that was going around a little while ago where there was an argument and somebody said, "Oh, you need to go and read this book," and they were talking to the author.
Oh, somebody did that to Stephen King.
Yes. Yeah. No, yeah. Someone
That's
has.
not the one I saw. I saw it on a scientific textbook, but it's just read the name, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not difficult.
Not quite as apt as that, but there was that woman that posted the picture of Elon Musk going, "Why can't I find a guy like this?" And he responded, "Hello there," and she was like, "No." And he was like, "I'm literally the guy in the picture." Leon says, whilst I disagree with utilitarianism, I find many objections absolutely hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it could be fun to play around with different moral theories. Philip says, indirect proofs are also reducto ad absurdum. It's a way to essentially draw inferences in logic. Yeah, that's fair enough. LB says, egalitarianism is the better one. Hey, clever thunderstorm flesh that thinks. I was having a chat with my buddy Phil about, he was just like about how your computer brain name could be stretched to mean clever thunderstorm flesh that thinks. And he hadn't thought of it that way before. He's Cantonese speaking. But yes, anyway, what you said is demonstrating absurdity by being absurd. Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, no, there is a valid use of being absurd when something is absurd in the first place. It's almost holding up a mirror to absurdity, and that is not a fallacious use of being absurd. You know, if you were being completely reducing to a genuine fallacy, is saying if we let men marry each other, then eventually we're gonna be having sex with dogs. You know, that would be reducing it to some completely. Well, it's also a bit of a slippery slope.
Well, I was about to say it goes kind of hand in hand with that slippery slope.
Yeah, but that would be a fallacious use because you're not necessarily doing it. But even slippery slopes, some of them are valid uses. If you can use sort of inductive reasoning and about things that have happened before, you know, generally if you give politicians more and more power, they take more and more and abuse it more and more. And so if we give them too much power, then they're going to take too much and abuse us in some way. You could say that that's a bit of a slippery slope, but it's been demonstrated in the past that that sort of thing happens. So not every fallacy is a fallacy, should I say. Like, they're not necessarily fallacious. You've got this list
I love
of...
the idea of somebody just being so ridiculous with it. It's like, oh, if I give my kid a knife, they might end up hurting themselves. That's a slippery slope fallacy. They might not.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I gave an
can
example.
Genuinely picture some people doing that, though. Some of the people that we've been in debate groups with, some of the people we've kicked out of the AiR group.
Yeah.
But that's true. I mean, if you were to allow your children to choose every meal that they ate, they would tend to choose the least healthy options. They would have McDonald's and KFC and chocolate and ice cream and all that. Now, not every child necessarily would. There might be the odd sensible, health-conscious child out there that would make a decent decision. But in general, that would happen. So with inductive reasoning and a bit of Kaizen, you can say that you shouldn't let your children choose every single meal. Maybe a treat meal Friday night or something like that. It's not a fallacy to say that. You're using inductive reasoning. Equally, induction isn't fallacious. It's not a black swan fallacy. The black swan is to highlight problems with induction, and there are problems with induction, but it's to be aware that just because it usually happens this way doesn't mean it always will. That's all. It's keeping your saying like, yeah, this is probably what's going to happen, not this is definitely going to happen based on this. That's basically what that one is.
I think a lot of people forget as well that just because an argument is fallacious, it doesn't automatically infer that it's wrong. It just means that the reasoning to get there was bad.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, some people even say that they don't necessarily believe their doctor when they say that their prescription is going to help them, because that would be an argument from authority. It is an argument from authority, but it's not a fallacious argument from authority. They've gone through all of their training to get to this point, and they constantly have to have refresher training. And when a new drug comes out, new research, they spend a lot of time looking at this. And do you know what? Yeah, do you know what? They may get it wrong sometimes. But the fact is, they know more about this topic than you do. And chances are, if you go into some random, debate group on Facebook, you'll end up with a bunch of anti-vaxxers telling you a load of misinformation. And I would much rather listen to my doctor, which I can verify on various medical sites, and look up more information if I am so interested. And I generally would if it's something serious. If it's something like, oh yeah, no, you've got this problem, take this and you'll be all right in a couple of days, I'd be like, okay. Yeah,
I was going to say, if an argument from an authority is always wrong, then go to a plumber for your appendicitis.
I mean, it's all basically plumbing in there.
Yeah, true.
Unless it's neurological, then you go to an electrician.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well, it's a
for your
short
computer
circuit.
brain. Bearded Heretic also says, I can't remember the last time I listened to Aaron Ra. I think that atheism has moved on since the early new atheism stuff. Yeah, I think that Ra has done a lot of good work in certain areas. His science stuff and his attempts to keep creationism out of schools and things like that. There is a lot of benefit to the work that he's done. I just think that he is a bit too dogmatic and ideological in his presentation of stuff. He doesn't listen to people when he gets corrected. He's been corrected on his definition of faith so many times, and he still harpers on with the same sort of thing. And so many people, apart from those with ideological reasons, have spoken out against his rocks are atheist things. New atheism, though, you mentioned that. New atheism was supposed to actually just be atheists actually talking out against, speaking out, should I say, against theists. So technically, any atheist that actually takes the time to speak out and contest a theist's beliefs is a new atheist, loosely speaking. The problem is that it was supposed to be done in a particular way, the right way, having a respectful, dialectical conversation, which hopefully ends with them questioning their beliefs more, maybe even deconversion, but generally people can only do that themselves. You just have to make them question. What's happened is it's become incredibly heuristic, and a bunch of people on the internet just shout at each other and scream at each other, and you end up with just battle after battle and no one listening to anyone, and everybody walking away as if they've won because they're a dumb atheist and they're a dumb theist. And you get terrible, terrible, weak arguments, misunderstandings of fallacies. I mean, there are so many times someone calls me out for committing a fallacy, and I'm like, but, for example, a straw man. And I was like, but you haven't made an argument yet, so how am I straw manning you? I'm only straw manning you if you've made an argument. I've just made a statement and you've said that's a straw man. Well, no, that's a statement you disagree with. Disagreeing with something doesn't make it a straw man. And so many atheists play fallacy bingo.
Make it.
Sorry, Chris.
Same as just insulting somebody doesn't make it a oh shit, the word's just gone.
Ad hominem.
Ad hominem, that's the one.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's so much, and that's why we try and address a lot of the behaviours with atheists online and common misunderstandings around things like the burden of proof. There are so many things, and like what a belief is, and for doing that, and Dave quite often actually gets called a theist troll, because we're not towing the line of what atheism says. Oh, they say it's not an ideology, there's no doctrine, but actually if you say something that we haven't heard from other atheists, you're clearly a theist because they're being tribal. And you're just like, right, I understand humans are tribalistic creatures, but atheists pride themselves on being better than that, being smarter and more rational, and what happens? They get into a tribe and become the same as everyone else.
My tribe's too smart to be tribal.
I'm too dumb.
I'm too late.
Clever Thunderstorm Flesh That Thinks says, is atheism just a lack of belief in gods? Just? No. Is that one of the definitions? Yes. If you want me to go into it, I can, but I think I say it enough. Oh, no, you've responded to yourself. Short answer, no. Long answer, no. Very good. You thought, Leon says, thought Twitter was bad. We make people on Facebook sound like actual lowest IQ humans around. I'd say Twitter probably is worse than Facebook in that regard in general, because of the shorter statements and the fact that everything is completely public, so anyone can see anything. So there's a lot more front and ego in something like Twitter, because if someone makes you look foolish, most people don't take well to that, and it turns into a massive explosion. Whereas at least if it's a private debate group, only people in that group are going to see you. You can always delete your comment, and you can leave the group if you're really that embarrassed. So, but you do get some some of the people, like the Dukes and the Chris Manns and the people like that, and the Randolphs. You get people like that everywhere. And you get other people like your lovely selves who are more interested in a dialectic conversation. And even if we do have a different ontological position or a position on any other topic, then yeah. Duke is in my Facebook group. Is he? I don't think he is.
No, he's asking you a question.
Oh, is Duke? See, sorry, I am dyslexic, so words jumble up sometimes. No, Duke isn't, but Chris Mann was. I don't know if he still is, but I got to a point where I just had enough of him, and we all stopped responding to him, didn't we?
Yeah.
So is Chris Mann famous in these circles?
No, Chris Mann isn't. No, basically, Duke had a conversation with Steve McRae, and it was a bit of a dumpster fire. And Chris Mann was basically in support of Duke, and he did a rational analysis. And we responded to his video, and then Dave actually wrote an article on it. And things like that, and using screenshots that both Duke and he had said, and that turned into a bit of a dumpster fire, and we ended up just stopping to respond to him on the article as well.
Was he the one that wrote an article somewhere bitching about us? Or was
that was Duke.
Else?
That was Duke. Yeah.
I get so muddled up with how many fuckwits there are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're fuckwits ourselves, but we at least admit it. It's actually quite funny though, because Dave has had much better conversations with Duke than I have, and he actually managed to. Duke now accepts that there are other definitions of atheism, and his preferred one, he doesn't say, is the only right one anymore. So, I mean, that was progress. But there are a number of conversations Dave's had where he's led him through a conversation in a very Socratic way, got him to agree with every single premise, and he said, right, with this following this, following this, following this, following this, the only conclusion available is this. And he'd go, no. And he'd just, like, completely backflip on it. And it was just like, and can you give us an answer why? No, because it's not. And it was always that sort of, it just isn't, that's not it is, it's just this way, but it's not that way. And you're just like, okay.
Like the good old Patrick Starfish meme.
That's the exact one.
I hope you shared a perfect one that described Duke to a T. And it was about propositions and walking through what a proposition is. And at the end, it's like, so you agree that a proposition is this? No. that just summed up Duke perfectly.
Yeah. Bearded Heretic says, are the recent protests in London examples of the problem of dirty hands, breaking lockdown legislation to make a political statement? Not exactly. Because I would disagree with what they're actually doing there. They're putting more people in danger. They're making a political statement without much validity to it. The government has dealt with what we've done wrong pretty much every step of the way. We needed a hardcore lockdown at the start and to cut off any ties with any country that like inbound and outbound flights that wasn't doing the same. You look at countries like New Zealand and Australia, and even though they haven't got a perfect record, they've done very well with it. Now, they're obviously not in a central flight path, and they're not a business hub in the same way that the UK is. But what they did was better, and we would have been out of this thing. And you know, the whole thing that the government are doing around the economy and this and that and another, it's a load of crap. Because actually, if you shut everything down for a shorter period of time, we're now stuck in a situation where we're still in limbo. We still don't know if we're going to be allowed out of our house by the end of the year. They're saying maybe by June now, depending on the vaccine schedule and all of that. So I don't think. I mean, if you're talking about the protests that were breaking lockdown, unless you're talking about the vigil for Sarah Evershed, something like that.
I think that's what he's talking about most likely.
Yeah. In that one, the vigil, yeah, that's a tough one. They were told not to do it because of the pandemic, and they did it anyway, and then they were arrested. And I find that one a bit difficult, because a lot of what they would say about the situation is very right. You know, about how women shouldn't feel threatened, how they should be able to go out and, you know, wear whatever, and we shouldn't victim blame and all of that sort of thing. But equally, you're in a pandemic and you're putting a lot of people at risk by holding this vigil. So it may
also have to address, though, how different police forces handled it very differently in different areas. The London police force went in.
They do what they always do.
Symbolically waving their dicks around and proving the point. Whereas there were these vigils in other cities where the police showed up, paid their respects, led flowers down themselves, and then said, okay, it's time to disperse now. We need to keep this shit under control. And people dispersed. And nobody was hurt. Nobody was beaten around the face with a fucking truncheon.
Yeah.
The Met handled it fucking
poorly,
abominably.
Yeah, no, they definitely did. And I think that is the key issue with it, really. If they had dealt with it like others had, then it would have probably been a lot better. But what's the argument? Should they have held the vigil? How many women have had this happen to them that didn't get a vigil?
That's kind of really not the point, though.
Yeah, but in the middle of a pandemic, it's the key factor that concerns me about this is it being in a pandemic and it being in certain high infection rate areas, and cities are some of the worst for the infection rates, because obviously they're closer in. So I find this particular situation quite a difficult one to think about. And if I'm honest, I still haven't sorted out my thoughts properly on the matter. I can look at different aspects of it and say, you know, I understand why they did it. It's something that needed to be done. More awareness needed to be raised for this sort of thing. There is still a lot of inequality going on, and not just between the sexes, but obviously this is related in that way. And I can understand why it's done, but then there's part of me going, we're in a fucking pandemic and you're collecting people together. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily regard it as a lesser of two evils in this situation. I think when we're out of lockdown, when things have calmed down, once everyone's vaccinated, there should be marches and protests and all sorts at that point in time. And there should be a lot of buzz about it on places like the internet. But consider it if it was something that was even worse than COVID. Now, COVID's taken a lot of lives, but let's say we had something even more infectious and something even more deadly. And it's something else. So let's say it was measles or the bubonic plague, and no one actually had a vaccination against that yet, or only a very few people did. Would you have the same attitude to it? As I said, my thoughts are still very jumbled on this one. I keep thinking one way, then I talk myself back to the other, and I'm at a point where I don't know.
I think personally that it was valid for them to get together. I have seen photos and videos of it throughout the day where most people were in masks. Most people were doing the best they could to socially distance. It only went to shit when the police turned up and started getting aggressive.
Stood right behind him, leaning over them, pushing them into barriers and things like that, forcing them to get close.
I've seen one report of police making somebody remove a mask so that they could be identified. And yeah, that is, at that point, it is really bad for them to be gathered.
Yeah.
But before that, there is such an important point that they're trying to raise. Look at the BLM protest last year. That was in the pandemic. We're looking at institutionalized sexism this time as opposed to institutionalized racism, but there are people who are getting victimized every fucking day. Every day of their life, they're living through fear, and something has sparked that. With the other thing, it was the guy dying by having his neck knelt on. With this, it's the girl dying. There is a
straw that breaks the camel's hump.
Exactly. But the protesters have been being sensible. Same with the BLM stuff last year. You see all the pictures of the protests. The vast majority of them are masked up and being distant. Can we really say, okay, if you're being sensible, still tough? You don't get to make this point yet. This point has to wait. And I don't think we can. I don't think that's fair.
No, that's a good point. That's a good way to look at it. So now I'm leaning back that way again, and I like I said, my thoughts on this are still quite jumbled. But
back to the dirty hands thing with the torturing the terrorist.
Yeah.
A gathering is for torturing. If they were gathering without the mask, it's torturing the children.
Yeah, I suppose lesser of two evils, perhaps. I'm not sure I'd regard it as a problem of dirty hands, but maybe it's the lesser of two evils. The people out there, they're putting themselves at risk, potentially their families at risk, but there is a greater good being achieved in the long run.
Best to stop that risk.
Yeah, in the future. And
whilst making a point.
Yeah. So from that perspective, it is something that needs to be raised. It is something that needs to be worked on. I mean, I know a lot of companies are doing more and more for their inclusion and diversity and gender pay gaps and all of that sort of thing. But I suppose it isn't enough, and it's not fast enough. And you almost do need to have these vigils and protests and things like that to get the ball rolling a little bit faster. So
you could look at it from this perspective. The problem is bad enough where a bunch of people have to risk their own lives to have their voices heard and affect change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah. I do not have a rebuttal to that. So, I mean, let's just say I'm definitely leaning that way now.
I mean, yeah, I agree. It would be better if this wasn't necessary. But it would be a fight better if this wasn't necessary because the problem didn't exist than COVID being the one way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. Hopefully that answered your question. I think you saw my mind twist in and double back on itself a couple of times there as I tried to think my way through a problem live on air.
Just don't think. That's what I do.
Philip says, speaking of lacktheism, did you know that lacking a belief in the Earth being a sphere in the face of evidence is perfectly rational? Is it now? Twitter is such a shithouse. This is LB saying, too much debate Mel mindset, like my unfortunate friend Philosophy Grove. I tried to tell him to stop. Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, he's just being incredibly aggressive and heuristic as well. I don't find his methods effective. He wants to have conversations with atheists. He's a theist himself, yet all he does is belittle and condescend. And he's like, I'm just giving them the taste of their own medicine. Like, okay, but does it, when it's used on you, does it get anywhere with you? No. So what makes you think you're going to get anywhere with them? You just end up in this circle jerk of tribalistic behaviors. And I feel some respects, we're talking about, look, theists aren't that bad. Like, most of the time, they're pretty smart, rational people. I disagree with their belief in God, but other than that, we agree on way more than we disagree with. So why don't we focus on the good things that we have together and maybe discuss beliefs, and maybe we might change our mind on a few things as well. And then you have someone like that acting that way and basically undoing the work you're doing with other atheists, trying to get them to have good conversations with people because he turns around and bites their head off for any little thing. The other day, Opie was having a conversation with him, or just in general, talking about the scientific method and doing science. And I would regard science from the point where it's institutionalized, but within the philosophy of science, there is an argument that actually the behaviors that led to science are regarded as doing science, even though it wasn't formalized at that point in time. So it's where you draw the line of where science is. And all he was doing was presenting that a different opinion from within philosophy of science. And he got his head bitten off as being a Dawkinite and dumb lacktheist. And she's just like, well, that's not going to get you anywhere. We're having a conversation. All of us here are just talking about it. All of us think that science is a social construct, but actually Opie's presenting a different argument. So let's analyze it. Okay, I can see his point. I need to think about it more. Having the argument isn't going on. Other than that, do you think they regarded it as the lesser of two evils? Yeah, I think they would have regarded it as the lesser of two evils. And thinking on it, it probably is the lesser of two evils if you go down a significant number of consequences. If you take out the first and second order effects of the fact that people could get infected, like these gents described, there is a much bigger problem than the fact that people could get COVID going on, and it needs to be addressed even at their own risk, and they are trying to be as safe with it as they can be. So yeah, fair. Just so you know, guys, I live a mile and a half away and visited the following day, and everyone was wearing masks and standing far away from each other. That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. So you probably live quite close to where I currently live then, because I'm not too far from Gatwick Airport. That's at least the easiest way I can describe it to people. I'm originally a Croydon boy. It's why I rag on it so much. It seems like he refuses to think atheism has a burden of proof. Yeah, so there is a common misunderstanding with a lot of atheists about what the burden of proof actually is. They think that it means that you have to prove the thing true. And if you're making a knowledge or truth claim, then you could argue that is the case, especially if you're trying to convince someone of your position. But if you're just holding a belief, then all you really have to do is justify the position to yourself. You can justify it to someone else if you're trying to convince them as well. But, with a belief, it's not to prove it true. And even if you only lack belief, there's still a certain amount of justification to do why you lack your belief in gods. And it's not as simple as no evidence, because that's an incredibly inaccurate and dismissive statement. Yes, you're right, bearded heretic. You got to bring moral philosophy into the real world, otherwise, what's the point? No, you're very right. A question for you all: when you're at the supermarket, uh, and there is you've got your trolley, you've gone to your car, you've unloaded everything. There's no money in the trolley or anything like that. Do you return it to the rank, or do you just leave it there? The ultimate trolley problem. Sorry.
As an ex-trolley collector, I say put your fucking trolleys back.
Yeah, I've always done that. In fact, even in my local co-op, when they've got the self-serve checkouts, and I often on my way out, I collect the baskets and I go and put them down there, because quite often you come in and there's no baskets because it's busy in there and they don't have enough staff, and it doesn't take me anything. I'm going that way anyway. I'm just happening to carry a pile of baskets with me. It's not a big problem, really. I think if everybody started with little things like that, little kindnesses, just the tiny ones. I mean, you can even see it when you smile and say hello to some random on the street. They always smile back. Well, always is wrong. Always is wrong. Quite often, they will smile back at you. They might be thinking, what a weirdo, but there's something in their head that when someone smiles at you and nods you and acknowledges you, that you can't help but react in a positive way as well. And if everybody did all these micro kindnesses to each other, I think the world would be in a better place, and the kindness would grow, and there'd be more and more and more of these kindnesses, and they would be getting bigger kindnesses. It wouldn't just be little things like a smile, a hello, a how you are taking your trolley or basket back. They would grow into much bigger kindnesses that we do for each other.
I'll just add that at the moment, go for a thumbs up, not a smile, because you should be wearing a fucking mask.
Yes, that's definitely true. Interestingly, I think because my daughter has actually learnt to work out, even from a young age, because whenever we've gone out, we've been in masks, learnt to read eyes, because I can grin at her with a mask on and she smiles back, and she's learnt what my eyes look like. It's a very different world raising a child in the pandemic world, where you can't really go out and you can't do all the things that you would usually do, and you can't any of that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's really interesting how she's learnt to read eyes.
I think that's actually quite natural for everybody, because you see people for a photograph and everybody goes, smile, and you go,
Yeah.
it's not natural, and you can pick up on that. Smiling naturally, it does include the eyes.
It does.
And I think everybody does pick up on that subconsciously anyway.
That's
It's
why
a
when
thing
with
that I
acting,
have to teach myself to do, because when people smile at me in the street, my natural reaction is to kind of scowl in confusion. I have actually been pulled up on that by somebody. Like, why did you look at me like that? It's like, I was confused. It's like, you're angry. It's like, no, they look quite similar. Sorry. How do I know him?
I wouldn't know about raising children. I think they're only good for Sunday roast dinners.
Carrying on with the chat, yeah, Philip's just going on about Philosophy Grove. I'll let you carry on that. He was, he thinks atheism necessarily entails physicalism. I don't think it necessarily does.
The other way around.
Yes, I would say physicalism entails atheism. Yes, definitely. But I mean, part of me goes that in general, you would find an atheist ascribing to some form of materialism, whether it's the lighter naturalism or the heavier physicalism. Generally, you would find an atheist doing that, but I don't think it's something that definitely entails that. And there are plenty of atheists that do believe some really weird mystical shit that you're just like, huh? What? Why do you believe in fucking ghosts, man, if you don't believe in souls and things like that? And what the fuck are ghosts in your worldview then? But you know, it happens. Yeah. Oh, apparently it's a key significant signifier of autism in children. They can recognize eye emotions. Interesting. Well, I hope for her sake that she is. I don't think she is, though. She's a complete terror. She's from a very young age. She's been very, very physical, and very, very affectionate as well, which isn't a typically autistic trait from my understanding. But she's been, I mean, she was started crawling at like 4 months, and she's been walking since 9 months, and she goes up to everyone and roars at them and all that sort of stuff. She's definitely a character. She also really likes bourbon. I have to be careful. I can't put a glass down anywhere near her because she'll grab it and down the whole thing. And it's like, how? This stuff burns, man, and you're taking massive gulps. Yeah. So back on the topic. Was there anything more that we needed to actually cover off with the whole dirty hands thing?
There's a few more things we could cover up, but we'll leave that for another stream. We'll just discuss value pluralism and things like particularism in its own stream.
Yeah, no, that's a very good one. So, I mean, if we were to summarize, the problem of dirty hands is, the question of, can you do something wrong to do something right? So an immoral action with a moral consequence. From a purely consequentialist perspective, there is no dirty hands, because all that matters is the consequence. But there is something intuitively wrong with that. From a deontological perspective, there can be conflicting duties, so you're left with complete indecision, and you don't know what you should do. But no matter what you do, there will be that dirty hands there, because you are going to break at least one of your duties. If you look at it through a different lens, for example, if you were to just tie it back to the purpose of morality as flourishing, and take a more moral particularist point of view, then you would probably still say the act itself is wrong, but the end result is the better result, and you wouldn't necessarily have the issue of conflicting obligations there, because you're still looking at the picture in itself, as well as tearing apart the two individual actions. Is that about it, Dave?
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome. Yes, I was a very proud dad when she did that, but I'm not allowed to be. So, no, you shouldn't touch Daddy's drink. Cool. Are there any more questions or anything like that? Because if there's not, I think we're pretty much done for the night. It's been an interesting stream, actually. I'm glad that it got a little bit of real world application, and it was nice to have you on with us, Chris. It's been a while since we've done a recording.
It was good to be on, and weird to have my son on.
Yes.
You come back for the episode on value pluralism and moral particularism.
Yeah,
me or my son?
both of you.
Yeah,
I definitely will.
Or we can drag him on, and
Okay.
we can say whether we torture him or not by the end of the stream. Don't be sorry, Kieran. Don't be sorry. We're just going to torture you next time. No, it was great to have you. It was great to have you.
It was.
So last one from LB, he says, is no offense to my theist friends and even deists, it seems like theists and deists have more sophisticated views for objective morality. It seems like theists and deists have more sophisticated views. Not necessarily, because I'd say most theists who are religious theists subscribe to divine command theory, which is a deontological set of rules that are provided by the holy book that they don't think about at all. They just follow them, and if they don't follow them, it's wrong. And personally, I think that is quite weak in itself, especially when you can see particular things in the Bible, like if stoning homosexuals, that we can all say is definitely wrong. So I wouldn't say they have more sophisticated views of objective morality, but they at least understand that their morality is objective because it's above their opinion, and nothing they do will change it. I agree with what
They
you
certainly
say.
they have an easier way to justify it because there is an individual arbiter,
Yes.
Yeah.
as opposed to a concept being an arbiter, which is much harder to properly nail down on.
Yeah.
And then you say also where lactheists use subjectivity and it's easier. Now that I would agree with. It comes between the argument because quite a lot of the time a theist will say if there's no God, then morality can't be objective, and so the atheist will respond with, well, morality is subjective because there's no God. And that tends to be quite a basic argument. There are different nuances and levels within it. But that tends to be sort of how that conversation goes. And I think in both instances, neither the theist or the lactheist has taken the time to fully understand morality. And even in conversations that you get with a lactheist, where you talk about them. So, for example, like the rape example I gave earlier, if a rapist says it's moral to rape, then if morality is wholly subjective, the truth maker is their opinion, therefore it's moral for them to rape. Do you agree that it's moral for them to rape, or do you hold them to a standard above their opinion? They will say, no, they're wrong. And so, okay, so you're showing that there is something above personal opinion. You're holding them to a standard above their personal opinion. You're treating morality objectively, even though you're saying it's wholly subjective. You could say it's mostly subjective if you wanted to. That would be a better way to present your case. No, it's wholly subjective. And you end up in this circle. But equally, you could explain to a theist about how there's different ways to have an objective standard, and they won't listen. They go, no, it's only objective if it's from God.
Going back to something that was said earlier about how two wrongs don't make a right. It is weird with the rape thing, but two wrongs do seem to make it not as bad, because if you steal shit at the same time, raping and pillaging.
It makes you a Viking, and it's never wrong to be a Viking.
So long as you steal stuff at the same time, it's not as bad. Fucking weird. I'm sorry, I'm not the only person who finds that weird, am I?
No.
Raping and pillaging sounds like a fucking holiday, apparently.
After a year in lockdown. Sorry, Dave, what did you say?
Everybody wants to be a Viking, so it's...
That's not a mini game on Assassin's Creed Valhalla.
I don't know. Yeah, it seems unlikely.
But
it could be a downloadable update. DLC.
But yeah, cool. Well, it looks like that was the end of the any questions and statements and things like that. LB just confirms it wasn't supposed to be a compliment to the theists. It's more of a criticism for theists and deists. It's more like it takes them more justification than anything else. Yes, computer brain, two wrongs don't make a right, but two rights make a U-turn. And as Opie said earlier, three rights make a left. Okay, so tonight's stream has been on the problem of dirty hands. We've looked at it through the lens of different ethical theories. We've discussed a number of thought experiments and applied ethics to a little bit of real world stuff too. I'd like to thank everybody that has been watching the stream and is going to watch the rerun as well, and especially everybody that had joined in the chat. That was absolutely fantastic to see you all there. Thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Yeah, cheers.
So you've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi stream. I'm Joe.
She's Chris.
And he's Dave.
Good night, all. And as you know, the stream tends to run on Tuesdays and Thursdays around 8 p.m. GMT. although sometimes a little bit later. And I quite often get on the turntables before the stream, although tonight it all went horribly wrong.